We all aspire to live in a sustainable and climate-neutral society. A net-zero society must be quite a nice place to live in, and it seems we're on a good way. My name is Florian Anderhuber. I work for Euromines on energy and climate issues. Euromines is the association of European mining industries, covering 50 different minerals and metals, extracted all over Europe. Europe and North America are the two regions of the world that manage to decouple their growth from emissions, albeit in two different ways. Europe puts a price on emissions. North America rather uses incentives, such as recently the Inflation Reduction Act. Which way works better or which way works worse? In any case, mining has a decisive role to play in the endeavor towards decarbonization. These questions we will elaborate with our guest Tomas Wyns. He's a preeminent expert at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. He's responsible and a contributor to many of the decarbonization roadmaps of different industrial sectors, and also the mind behind the master plan of the energy-intensive industry, a landmark study bringing together for the first time all of the energy-intensive sectors to define what their potential and the conditions are for them to decarbonize until 2050. Welcome to the Euromines Mining Podcast presented by the Sustainable Mining Initiative. And now, let's talk to Tomas. Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of our mining podcast. Today we will talk about the decarbonization of our society and the decarbonization of the mining industry. And we have with us Tomas Wyns. You are a researcher at the Brussels School of Governments at the Vrije Universiteit of Brussels, a Flemish-speaking one, and you have had quite an eclectic CV. So you started out as a physicist, you have a background in international relations, you worked in conflict resolution, you worked in NGOs, you worked for the Flemish government, you accompanied the ETS from its very inception, from the very beginning, right? Now you're back to academia and you are advising different EU industrial sectors on their climate transition. Is this right?
That's in a nutshell correct, yes.
So tell us a bit about your current work and how your previous experiences shaped your fascination or your interest in the energy-intensive industries.
Yeah, as you said, it started basically with the design of the emissions trading system in 2001, where I was negotiating it for Belgium, for the Flemish government. And then the most important thing, we had to implement the emissions trading system. And that's basically how I got to know the energy-intensive industries and locally in Flanders. But it's a very intensive region with refining, with steel, with a lot of chemicals. And basically, I've stuck to that, always working on an industrial sector related to climate change. But what frustrated me a little was that there was little scientific, but also little policy interest in how these sectors could change. And that's the reason why I went into academia, to basically help science forward and also help policymakers forward in the end.
And before we're going to that one, so in 2001, the ETS looked very different, I assume. What has changed? What were the elements that were added over time?
Yeah, there was a lot of learning by doing, and we started with the test phase. A lot of data needed to be gathered. Countries didn't know which type of industries were covered or not. There were limits on combustion capacity. We started off with free allocation to the power sector. That was a big mistake. So that went into auctioning, because the power sector, as we know, passes through everything. Anyways, what we pioneered in Flanders, that's interesting, was the concept of benchmarking. We were the first country to actually use benchmarking in the allocation, and so the Commission stole that from us in a later phase.
You were the ones, you were the responsible ones for this.
Yeah, we created a lot of headaches, I guess. But also, it's in the end, it's an element of fairness in how you treat different companies. What else changed? We had a big economic crisis and a large surplus of allowances in the trading system, so a very low price for a long time. And that got corrected through a market stability reserve. Those, I think, major changes, and the most recent changes, of course, possible extension of the scope of the trading system to transport buildings, and then the CBAM, the border adjustment measure.
Right. So now the ETS has been around for nearly a quarter of a century. It's quite a long time. What do you think are now the most important challenges for industry when it comes to decarbonization? Energy intensive in general.
It is still the investment challenge mostly. We know that for most energy-intensive industries, the processes will need to radically change. Whether you electrify, you go through hydrogen, or you work with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or you change to biomass. All of these options require major investments. What we know now is that the technologies are out there. Some are relatively mature, others are still less mature, but we need to get them deployed. That's at this moment, I think, the major, let's say, technical challenge. There are other challenges, but that's the major one.
Isn't it a success story according to you? Like when you started, this would have been totally unthinkable. It's a carbon-free sponge iron made out of pellets and with a green hydrogen. Is this the future, you think?
It can be the future. Although it is often perceived that industry doesn't move fast, we see now options on the table like hydrogen-based steelmaking that were not discussed 20 years ago. It was not even thought about really as a large application in European steelmaking, or an electrified cracking process in chemicals. Utilization of materials for cement production. There's a lot of things that really got activated, and I think the ATS played a role there. Maybe not through the pricing itself, but certainly through the awareness that the supply of allowances would get stricter, and then you would face constraints. So you needed to find a solution.
Right. So, and you worked on the decarbonization roadmaps of several industries, and you will also work on the decarbonization roadmap of mining. So, what do you think? What do all of these industries have in common?
Well, what they have in common is the energy intensity. So they basically, their energy, whether it is energy for power, heat, or as a feedstock, is their livelihood. And most of the costs of these companies are energy, whether it's fossil energy or electricity related. What they also have in common is that they are, let's say, the starting point of key value chains in Europe, from automotive through construction to really specialized sectors, electronics and so on.
So it's a bellwether study, for example, that you provided. Also very, very interesting read. But you also worked on a so-called master plan that was published in 2017 or 2018. Yeah. What has changed in terms of ambition on the industry side, but also on the regulatory side since then?
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating about that master plan is that for the first time, all energy-intensive industries in Europe came together and said, we want to think together about our future. And that, I think, helped a lot to, let's say, gain access and credibility within the European Commission that there needed to be such a master plan. I don't know that much has changed. We have a Green Deal, we have sharper targets, we have a net zero target for 2050, but a large, let's say, industrial decarbonization program with sufficient means for investment, with removing hurdles through investment is not there yet. We see small efforts. Critical Raw Materials Act, the Net Zero Industry Act, but certainly the last one really hasn't got much power. On the other hand, the last year, since 2018, we've been governed by external facts, issues that were of a large scope, such as COVID and now the war in Ukraine.
So you make an allusion also to this industrial deal to complement the Green Deal. What would this entail?
An industrial deal, it will have to do with policy, and it will have to do with also the governance thereof. And maybe start with the last one. I think we need better coordination between member states, between member states, the European Union, European Commission, and within the European Commission. So there are a lot of policies at European level that affect industry one way or the other, whether it's environmental, air, water, can even be fiscal or monetary policies. Look at, for instance, the high interest rate we see currently that increases the cost of capital and deters in investment. So better coordination there for sure. And then also looking at I think I really have a principal value chain approach. What does Europe need in the future? What do we want to do? And how can we safeguard critical value chains to achieve that? And that in a context which is significantly different from the context of, let's say, the 90s, where we had internal markets, international trade, WTO was still functioning. And now we are in a context where some of our international partners, let's say, do not have the best eye on Europe, to say it with that. So we need to be, let's say, more protective of our raw materials, of our industries, and make sure that we create resilient value chains. Of course, to have a resilient industry, but also to achieve this Green Deal, to achieve prosperity and all the other good things that come with it.
Where do you locate mining in all of this?
Mining is the start of these value chains. That's one element. It provides the materials for an endless amount of things we might not even see or know about, and in particular some of the technologies that are critical for the Green Deal, from electric engines, high voltage cables, batteries, solar panels. It's all there. So without mining, there is no Green Deal. And then I talk mining in general. And then within the context of security of supply, mining in Europe is important and will have to become more important.
So the importance of raw materials for the energy transition seems to be pretty evident to you. And since the master plan with carbon pricing, with the decrease, Europe is one of the only regions in the world that managed to decrease CO2 emission, greenhouse gas emissions. What was the impact on competitiveness, according to your insights? Did we really achieve to decouple growth from emissions?
It's what we did. That's what the data says. We decoupled growth and emissions in quite a big way. But you have to look below that. The growth is the general GDP growth. What is growing? And we see that other sectors in society, services, for instance, are growing much faster than industry is growing. There's also decoupling there. Not in all regions, but in major economies within Europe, you see that the GDP growth of other sectors is growing quicker than the GDP growth in industry. We had some major hits on industry in the economic crisis. In Southern Europe, you had a collapse of cement production, ceramics production, textiles was hit over and over in Europe again. We had some closures in steel in Europe, UK and France. So this crisis has hurt us a lot, and that's something that also, let's say, fascinates me, that every crisis we see a recovery, but in industry there is something which we call as sort of scar tissue, that we don't see this full recovery of production. And after COVID, we saw this to a little extent, not that much. We had a very quick recovery. I think that played a role there. But now with the energy crisis, I think we're at the limit, that we see some temporary closures, in particular in areas that are very electro-intensive. Think of fertilizer industry, but also some of the metals producers. And if prices and competitiveness does not go in the right direction, we might see some permanent closures, again, as a consequence of a crisis. I see no direct link to the Green Deal or the ETS as having, let's say, a permanent major negative impact on competitiveness at the moment.
Okay, but do you think this is also the promised growth strategy? Or will it have a neutral impact on the competitiveness in the long run?
I think that there is no growth strategy overall. If you don't consider your economy from a holistic value chain perspective, and that is not what is happening, you cannot conjure up growth. I compare this to other regions, US and China. If they want to see growth in a certain sector, is the solar panels or now the battery electric vehicles, they target the whole value chain. They support every part of it, and that's how you create this growth. That's not something we've seen in Europe. We've seen indeed the wish to electrify transport, but then you have to look at where are our battery producers, where are the raw materials for
Where
our
the
batteries?
miners.
Exactly, and that is missing in the European growth strategy. Or you have conflicting policies that might limit the development of certain areas of that value chain.
Is this card issue that you're referring to, competing policy objectives, cost structures that are imposed on the industry, despite efforts to follow through with the sustainability objectives that are set?
I don't know what to answer on that one. You could be very cynical and say, okay.
Oh, we don't want to be cynical here. We want to provide solutions. We want to be forward-looking.
But we see it currently. Current EU ETS prices are lower. Why is that? One of the reasons is that industrial production is down and has been down for a while. It's one of the reasons, not all reasons, but it's one of the important reasons. So is that a success? No, that is not a success.
So high prices would actually be a sign of a lot of industrial output, a lot of industrial production.
Yeah, that's what you that's what you normally would see. That if you have an overheated economy, then ETS prices would be much higher.
So the prices we saw before the slump, it was up to 160, even higher, no?
Yeah.
Was this an outlier, or was it a structurally good, showing the robustness of EU industry?
I would call it an outlier because it was double negative news. We saw these high prices 21, 22 at the moment of the energy crisis, and there's a link there because natural gas prices were very high, so coal use went up, and that was a driver towards higher ETS prices. So companies, again, these electro-intensive companies, were not only hit by high just production of electricity prices, but also high CO2 prices at the same time. So there, it was indeed an outlier, and of course, very, very counterproductive.
But Europe is also the only place in the world that really has these high CO2 costs, and also putting CO2 costs into electricity price. At the same time, I mean, there is this staple demand of a level playing field. And according to you and your insights, how would such a level playing field look like?
Ideally, you have a global carbon price, and everybody has a similar system with a similar pricing. That's
in
likely
absence of that.
we don't have it to happen. But what you see is that the introduction of CBAM is indeed activating some countries to do more on climate. Some neighboring countries, some countries that are important trading partners with regard to the materials that are now covered within CBAM. You see some action there. So that is interesting to see at least. Yeah.
So CBAM is a means to spread emission trading systems, not necessarily to stop imports.
In the end, from a climate perspective, that's what you want, that you have a global ambition level that increases gradually. Yeah.
All right. So let's zoom in a bit into mining and the decarbonization of mining as an industry. So it's a very diverse sector, and many different minerals and metals, many different production methods, and many different emission profiles. So why should Europe still engage in mining? Why shouldn't we just import all of the raw materials that are mined from elsewhere?
First of all, because we have them. We have the natural resources, maybe not as plenty as in other regions around the world. So it's something we could extract. Also because it decreases our dependency on third countries. So that is the second factor. And the third element is, of course, because you enable again a value chain that can create incredibly high value products in the end, from Green Deal technologies, information technologies, defense applications. It's all there. It's also hypocritical that, let's say, we don't want to mine in Europe, maybe for environmental reasons, but we have no problem that in some other part of the world there is mining happening without any or very limited environmental concern. I think this is
So locally increasing the carbon footprint, but therefore globally decreasing it. This is the way we should go.
Yeah, but also the other negative impacts that can come with mining on impacts on water or air. That in Europe we have quite strict rules for. The rest of the world has very little, or labor conditions, something else.
How much would you say is the gap for a ton of ore between that is mined in Europe and mined in another place in the world?
CO2 intensity.
CO2 intensity, yeah.
I have no idea.
You have no idea.
It will depend on, let's say, the type of material, but also on the quality of the ore, which low quality ore can lead to a higher energy intensity in the processing afterwards.
And as a corollary out of that, mining, is it as strategic as, for example, agriculture? Agriculture is 2% of EU GDP, but no society works without agriculture. Would you agree to that?
If you look at the history of human evolution, mining and agriculture have always been key drivers towards forwarding our society. Of course, you can say, okay, I can't live with food for a week. I can live without copper for a week, but then the life standard will diminish incredibly because I will have no power, no internet, no car, or anything. So it is as critical. Yes, yeah.
So mining, I mean, in Europe, can tell you, and you probably have seen this already too. The decarbonization pathway, what companies are decarbonizing with trolley lines and the use of hydrogen, as we've just seen before. However, this comes at a cost. And this somehow needs to be reflected in a business case. And there we sometimes have also regulatory bottlenecks or hurdles that need to be addressed. How would, according to you, elements of such a business case look like? Where would you start?
We're faced with two issues in decarbonization for most industries, including mining, is that you have your CapEx challenge. You need to invest. You need to have capital to invest in something new. And the second element is your operational. What is it cost to run that new process on hydrogen or electricity? Both are negative in a sense, like it's a lot of capital, more capital for the new process than for an existing one, which has been done 1,000 times over. Operational expenditure can be much more. So,
what is driving the costs?
Driving the cost is it depends. If it's hydrogen, it is more expensive to make as such. If it is electrification, depends from region to region, but it tends to be more expensive than natural gas. So these factors drive it for sure.
Electricity generation from renewables doesn't cost anything. So how come this electricity is more expensive than gas, natural gas?
Well, you see companies. The companies are really interested in renewable electricity. So the power purchase or green power purchase agreements are going up. So companies say, I want to buy pure renewable electricity. They have an advantage there. They might pay a bit lower price, and the producer of renewables has a benefit because there is a long-term contract and cost of capital might go down for new investment. But in the end, it is the wholesale market that determines the price. And then that it starts with renewables, which you can't always steer. So they're there or they're not there. And then it goes up through gas, nuclear, and coal in the end, if needed. And you pay the marginal price. What is highest is what you pay to the market. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why you pay more for electricity than you would pay if you would have only renewables. But I'm pretty sure that there will be companies in the future that will say, okay, we have sufficient surface area, we might invest in backup batteries if we have sufficient capital, and we provide our own electricity remote from the grid. This will be a very, very high investment, but it's something that maybe some companies might look at. Or companies that, due to electrification, and you see that in metals already, can provide services to the grid. Okay, we can let's say adjust our production to the power price. And if there's a lot of renewables, cheap price, and then we produce more. If there's less, we produce less, and therefore we provide a service to the grid and we get rewarded. So that's a new business model that might make things
There's a stabilization anchor of the grid. So in the future, let's say we really manage to get rid of all the fossil electricity production. How would the marginal price, as you said before, who would set it? Would it be nuclear? Would it be the storage provider of this electricity? Who would be it, according to you?
It will be something which is storage related. If there is no fossil whatsoever in the system, likely storage, maybe small modular nuclear reactors. I can imagine as setting the marginal price. But also you could imagine if there is still fossil, it might be a gas plant with carbon capture and storage, for instance. Yeah.
Now looking at the decarbonization of mining and investments needed, what would be avenues for mining to decarbonize, given the plethora of different production methods and metals and minerals that are mined?
Electrification is always going to be a prime option. And that's something we also noticed compared to a couple of years ago, even when we developed the master plan, is that electrification is gaining more importance. It's becoming more, let's say, accessible to more sectors. In the beginning it was low temperature electrification. Now we also see options to electrify processes with higher temperatures. Electrification of transport, and that's also important for mining, where, let's say, large vehicles, a couple of years ago thinking was, there will be hydrogen or an e-fuel. And now they are being electrified and they're being used, and they're being used by mining companies. So that direction seems to be quite clear. If you have processes that require the reduction, say, of iron ore, then you will have to step away from fossil reducing agents such as coal, and then hydrogen is becoming an interesting option. Yes.
So indirect electrification also requiring a lot of
electricity. Indirect electrification.
Yeah.
You could also think, if the option is there, geothermal heat for some of the processes, since it is linked a little bit to mining, but that's also something that's far future.
With all the electricity that we need, are we getting to this capacity? Do you see the investments undertaken right now for 2030, that there is enough capacity and enough grid, actually, to have access to this enormous amount of electricity?
Yeah, you could. Overall, for Europe, you could basically guesstimate or model that the electricity demand in 2050 will be double of what it is now. So when we want to green that, it's not only the current production, we will need to green, and it's around 3,000 terawatt hours a year. We also need to invest 3,000 terawatt hours more in additional renewable or other production. It's a major challenge. I think the goal of tripling capacity by 2030 is the right one, and maybe it should even be more to achieve the goal in 2050. What are bottlenecks? Of course, you need a lot of capital to get that done. You need to have the infrastructure there. You also will need to be flexible when it comes to permitting, because we're at 2030, 6 years from today. In some cases, it takes 2 years to get a permit, so that will need to be accelerated. So initiatives under the Net Zero Industry Act to make sure that certain areas get a prime, let's say, development priority for renewables, and lower permitting hurdles. That is going to be very important. If you wanna, it's not only we need to do a lot, but we need to do it fast. So that's the second element.
And is the price signal, as it stands now, a useful indicator where these investments need to take place?
The pricing?
The price signal. The price signal.
The carbon price or the
spot price, the electricity spot price.
Since it is, let's say, higher on average compared to a few years ago, it gives an incentive to investments. Yes, to invest more, for sure. Whether that will be maintained, that is another question, and I don't know.
but it is efficient. Is it efficient? Let's put a question like this.
According to economic theory, marginal pricing is, let's say, the most efficient way in which you give a signal towards, let's say, the market and investors to produce electricity in the most cost-optimal fashion. Yes. What is a problem, I think, is the fact that this marginal price also includes other things. And one important thing is CO2 price. And so again, to give the example, you have your renewables, your nuclear, and then you have gas and coal at the margin. And certainly with the CO2 price, it's going to be coal at the margin. So a company or a customer, any customer, pays CO2 for the full electricity they purchase, as if it was purchasing, I'm exaggerating a little, electricity from a coal-fired power plant. So there's a huge windfall and a huge cost there. And if we want to push industry, but also consumers, electric vehicles, heat pumps, towards electrifying more, having a signal in there that is in bulk massively exaggerated is a massive cost in the end. I don't think it's something we should pursue. We should pursue other ways of pricing CO2. You could imagine, and the reason it is in the marginal cost is that we made the power producers responsible for their own emissions. So coal-fired power plant, the gas-fired power plant, they need to purchase their allowance. You could also say, okay, we make the end users responsible, a mining company, a chemical company, or a household. And if you have a green contract, well, then you don't pay for the CO2. You will only pay if you have to buy CO2. Electricity at the margin from a coal-fired power plant, and you will pay the actual emissions that occurred there. That could be a way in which we still have a signal, the same signal, same carbon price, but at a lower overall cost for society. This is quite controversial, but given that we now know that electrification is going to be so important, we must put all options on the table to reduce the cost of electricity because it's going to hamper the transition.
Making the commodity on which we rely more expensive will not necessarily help with the pickup of this commodity in the processes, I would say. Yeah.
I mean, and the counter argument you give is okay, but this carbon price, it helps renewables because
it does.
They get a higher price. They also get paid. They get the market price paid. You could counter that by saying, okay, but if we make the end users responsible, there will be also a higher demand for renewables and the willingness to pay more.
So it's more like the demand side economics than the supply side. It's supply is not generating demand, but the other way around.
Exactly. I think a lot of European policy, also national policy, has been targeting the supply side. Is that a cap on emissions or a target here and there? That we should look more at the demand side. That's what also other countries are doing partially. If you look at the US Inflation Reduction Act, giving a tax break for, let's say, using a certain type of electricity or using hydrogen, then you are more closer to the demand side policy than the supply side.
So you said before that, I mean, economic theory tells us marginal pricing allows for the most efficient allocation of resources. So in terms of energy production or electricity production, then, if we have a marginal price setting, and it shows the allocation of resources in the most efficient way, do we have then rather a regulatory issue regarding permitting and grid expansion and the capacity expansion, or is it really rather a matter of the transfer of the CO2 price?
So the CO2 price is a major issue there, but of course you want your market to operate as efficient as possible. So you want your market to get access to most options. And that means that you will need to invest more in infrastructure that links supply and demand much better. It's an issue they had in Germany with the supply of renewables in the north and the demand of industry in the south. So there is clear need of major investments. Also, if offshore wind is going to become a major industry, this will require major infrastructure investments so that we create a grid in the North Sea that can provide, let's say, Europe's industrial heartland with green electricity.
Who will build this grid? Who will build this infrastructure? Where is this infrastructure coming from? This is a question I ask myself.
The transmission system operators, and of course, directly or indirectly funded by the public sector.
And where will they get the materials from? I mean, you will need copper, you will need steel, you will need a lot of different materials to work this one out.
But that is fascinating, and that is an example of green growth, where you build something new and you require a whole industry to support you. That it's not only the mining, but it's also the copper producers, the wire producer, the electronic producers, all below that. And if we can ensure that we have such a healthy value chain in Europe, that's how you secure most employment, most growth, most welfare, and so on.
Great. And one topic that we haven't touched upon yet, carbon capture and storage or utilization. Where do you see the chances for this technology to be picked up? Will it be cost effective at one point?
It will never be cost effective, in the sense it will always be a cost. Certainly with storage, with utilization, there is the option to recover some of the cost because you're making a product out of it. You might get something, some return back, but in a sense, it will be comparable to a sulfur dioxide or a nitrous oxide filter. You will have to invest in it. You don't get the return on so carbon capture, and it will need to happen for some industries. Some industries have process emissions. And with steel, we have hydrogen, but in some cases, hydrogen is not an alternative. So you will have to capture and utilize or store the CO2. And it will be important for cement, and it will be important for parts of the chemical industry for sure.
And also mining.
And mining.
Also mining. It's one of our pillars to decarbonize, actually.
Yeah. And of course, one of the bottlenecks here is that what we think will happen is that major industrial clusters, I think harbor regions, will be the first to invest into the infrastructure for CO2 capture and transport. With mining, things might be a bit more complicated, where you have remote areas, and who is going to invest in a pipeline of 500 or 300 kilometers to the sea? So that. We see that also with all other smaller industries such as glass or ceramics, which might maybe also have the option, but are not located often into these industrial hubs, and they will have to think about other options.
Yes. Yeah, transport will be a major option, and then it's also the question of if the market is ready to absorb these kind of costs, because very often you cannot simply pass this on to the consumer. Do you see solutions coming up for these kind of markets, creating lead markets for low carbon products, creating a certain awareness of what my consumption footprint is if I, use these goggles here, not knowing where the copper inside is coming from?
Yeah, I think again we're back at the demand side, and we might have to resort to classical demand side measures such as standards. For instance, we have standards on CO2 emissions for cars. We have Euro norms, but you could also start thinking about standards on the CO2 intensity of the materials, and that is interesting because then you create a level playing field. We don't care where your steel or your copper comes from, but it must be in 2050 net zero emissions. What is also interesting is that the end consumer will not notice much of a price difference. A car made from zero CO2 steel will be 1% more expensive. It's like for the average car price in Belgium, 25,000 euros, it will be 200 euros more expensive. If you would lower the VAT from 21 to 20%, the end consumer won't notice it, basically. And what is interesting from the other end is that the miner that is net zero, the steel producer, that is net zero, they can pass through their costs. And the automotive company can absorb the cost, can pass it through to the consumer. The end consumer doesn't see much. But it only works if you set a standard, because if there is no standard, then you have again the competition between the high CO2 materials and the low CO2 materials.
This is interesting.
It's a radical idea. It comes with a lot of World Trade Organization issues and so on. But I think it is the direction we need to go into, because if you do that for steel, for instance, ideal world, the European Commission sets a standard on steel in cars needs to be net zero as soon as possible. It's a market of 30-40% of steel production you cover at once in Europe.
Isn't CBAM going into this direction?
CBAM is a good learning experience, because you gather data that might be relevant to do that later, yes.
When you say the final consumer will only marginally feel a difference, or maybe not at all if the right tax incentives are in place, what about then the cost for the first producer, so the miner, who would be considered in the emission structure as a scope 3, so very, very far away from the final consumer emitter? How will they be able to pass through these kind of costs?
Well, that depends on the scope of the standard you set. If the standard includes all emissions that are, let's say, downstream from the car manufacturer to the steel producer to the miner, they are covered. So if you want to say the steel in my car is net zero, this also includes then, you can also include then the iron ore extraction and so on. That's a possibility. It makes things more complicated, but there's no reason to not do that.
Now, a very provocative question. 2050, net neutrality. Will we achieve it with a competitive industry?
We will need to do both. The ideal scenario is that we achieve it with an industry that is more competitive than it is today. That is what we should aim for. We should not aim for anything less. We should not aim for, we do net zero and we try to save industry. No, industry might look completely different. A materials producer might be half materials, half services producer. We don't know, but that is what we should aim for. Create value chains that generate a lot of value added, that provide also security of supply in Europe, create jobs, create know-how, create innovation, do it all in a low carbon way. That is the dream we should go for. Yeah.
And the Commission just recently published a 2040 decarbonization target, an interim target of 90%. This essentially means an already decarbonized industry.
Well, there isn't actually a target. There is a proposal by the Commission to set a target for at 90% by 2040. I think at this moment we must be very careful. Targets might become straitjackets. They can also, of course, they're an ambition level, something you want to go through. I think right now it is more important to think about the policies and measures in the broad sense, the governance that enables us to achieve such a target. That should come first before setting such a target in the first place. There is a risk you get a disconnect with the wider public and with industrial sectors that, okay, we're still digesting current Green Deal, we're still implementing Fit for 55, that this might be too much at the moment. It will only work if there is a wide enough range of measures, support, financing, infrastructure, coordination of regulation, better governance that helps us to get there. That should come first.
All right. What would be elements?
What would be elements? I think the industrial deal as something industry proposed.
What about indirect cost compensation? Indirect cost compensation. So compensation for we talked at length about it before, the CO2 costs in the electricity.
It's something weird. So we have the CO2 cost in electricity price, but then industry gets compensated. It's a bit a Rube Goldberg machine where you do something and then you try to compensate it, and it's not compensated in every European member state. So again, a reason to simplify that significantly. We discussed about one of the ideas that could do that take the allowances away from the power sector and make the industry and people responsible for their emissions. That's a way that could deal with that. Yeah.
Mining and the climate change mitigation. So it seems a bit of a catch-22. You need mining, as we said, for the technologies and for the materials, for the technologies that are necessary to mitigate our climate target. But in order to decarbonize these materials and to decarbonize mining, those materials need to be somehow already in place. How would you resolve this catch-22?
It's a catch-22 that is there for most energy-intensive industry. You need the steel, you need the chemicals, you need fertilizers. And I think it's also the frustration you see in industry, as a lot of is asked from industry to reduce emissions, and at the same time,
we need to rethink burden sharing.
And you need to provide the materials, and you need to grow. So you need to get out of that, let's say, investment conundrum. And what you can think is of support systems. Think of what the US IRA is doing and working with fiscal incentives. Of course, very complicated at European level. You need unanimity to get there. But if let's say, this is a very noble goal to achieve. So think really about a European way of getting there. So that's an important element. Also, industry will need to get permits for the new installation, so making sure that is there. Also make sure that you don't have conflicting regulations in place, so that it's all streamlined. And I think the idea of, let's say, a Timmermans for industry, a vice president for the industrial deal is something definitely to look at least. That there is coordination and improved governance happening at Commission level. Also, I think with a very close interaction to the member states, financing, and there you get complaints by some member states that the relaxed state aid rules benefit the countries that are richer. So if you want to keep European cohesion, definitely a solution must be found there. And I think a European funding mechanism is something to consider there. Again, politically not easy, but definitely worth doing it.
Thomas, thank you very much. As a very last question, how would a perfect decarbonized industry world look like in 2050?
Net zero Europe society will be, and if we do it well, will be a very nice one to live in. We will have incredible productive and flourishing industry across the value chain. We will have cleaned up our air. We will have very silent and efficient transport. It's basically the path to get there, and that means we need to secure the innovation, the investments in the critical value chains to bring us there.
And you are offering now a class at your university, at the Vrije Universiteit of Brussels, to precisely train the people to get us there.
We thought about what could we do more for society, and one of the goals of university is to teach. So we're now teaching chemical engineers sustainable chemical processes, where we introduce them into the new processes that are there, hydrogen-based, CCS-based, and what we hope is that this course will become the standard in the future, not a course on sustainability, but a course that will teach the default processes that are present in Europe in industry.
So you were at the helm to define benchmarks in the ETS, and now you're at the forefront to define new ways of studying. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in to this episode. I think it was very interesting, very eye-opening, and I hope it gave you an appetite to listen in for more. Thank you.